Good afternoon. It's April 1st. I don't know if you've had any April Fool's jokes played on you yet, but I guess I've had mine. This will be my second time recording this video. The first time I got through it and was going to upload it, just was testing to see the volume, and there was no volume whatsoever. So after trying to edit the video together and put it all up online, I'm doing it all over again. But you know what? You just roll with the punches and you go on. I will say that if you watch this video and you're like, well, that wasn't so good, you just should have heard the first one. It was amazing. Just, my family was weeping in the background. It was so good. But oh well, it is what it is. We're going to look at our text in Philippians today, and we're going to be in Philippians 2 verses 12 through 18. I'll read the text for us, then we'll try to work our way through it, and hopefully this video will come out the way it was supposed to. Philippians 2 verses 12 through 18. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or questioning, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you should be glad and rejoice with me. Today we're looking at a little bit shorter text than maybe we did the last few days, but it's good for us to be reminded of where we've come from and where we're going. As Paul writes these letters, we have to remember, he's writing them as one complete thought. We tend to break them down in chapters and verses, but that's not how they're intended to be read. So we need to know where we're going. And Paul has been encouraging and strengthening and desiring that they would that the gospel would advance, that the people, his readers, would be advancing the gospel. And to do that, they need to be like Christ who lived the ultimate example of humility. And now he turns to us and calls us to be lights in the world. And how are we to be lights in the world? And so we begin by looking at verse 12, where he says, Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence. Paul calls and appeals, I should say, to their obedience. He calls them to obey, even as they have done. Obedience is an important aspect of the Christian life, and it's an obedience unto God the Father. Now, Paul says here, he contrasts kind of the obedience they had when he was in their presence with the obedience in his absence. And we can kind of I think of it this way, as it's easier as children, when I was a child or with my own children, I know that there's a greater likelihood that they're going to obey if I'm there with them. If I say clean the kitchen and then I stay in the kitchen, they're more likely to do what I ask them to do. But if I give them a chore, or if I was given a chore for that matter, and said, go do this, but my parents weren't standing over me, there was a much less likely chance that I was going to obey the way I should. And Paul understands this about us. He understands something of who we are as people, that we have a tendency when we're kind of out of sight, out of mind, that we're not as likely to obey. And so he's encouraging the Philippians, and he's encouraging us that we're to obey. Even as we obeyed when Paul was around, even as they obeyed when Paul was around, so much more now that he is not there. They need to continue to obey. And why are they to continue to obey? Well, he says to them, you need to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. There's a need for obedience, an obedience that expresses itself in the working out of faith. I think this is particularly true now in our time of quarantine. Even as we just considered, we're not around each other every day. In fact, it's now been what? It's been 2 Sundays where we haven't met. It's been even longer since we've been able to get together at all as a church. And it's hard to be obedient in times when we're so distant from one another. I always find it as an encouragement when I'm going to church and I get to be there with you and you get to encourage me and strengthen me and remind me of how I am to live out my life as a Christian. And hopefully I do the same for you and we do the same for one another. We need this call to obedience, an obedience that expresses itself as we work out our salvation with fear and trembling. Now, when we talk about that word fear, that seems like an odd word, I think, for us, because we tend to think of fear in the sense of I'm scared. Maybe a fear in the sense of I'm watching a scary movie. That's not really the full sense of the word here. We have to understand that we work our salvation out before a holy, mighty, and powerful God. And so we work out our salvation with fear and trembling, understanding, as the Bible tells us, that we don't fear those who can destroy the body. We fear those who we fear Him who can destroy the soul. And so we don't have to fear the coronavirus, and it may destroy our body, but we don't have to fear it. We only have to fear Him who can destroy the soul. And so we work out our salvation with fear and trembling, understanding whose presence it is that we're coming into as we do that. And it's not, don't misunderstand me, it's not that we question our salvation. It's not that we say, oh, I have to work this out, and if I don't do this good enough or I'm not worthy enough, then somehow I won't be welcomed into God's presence. It's the understanding that through Jesus Christ, we have already been brought into the presence of God, but we should never do that flippantly or half-heartedly or take that for granted. We should be working out our salvation with fear and with trembling. He continues in verse 13, for it is God who works in you both to will and to work for His good pleasure. Paul, first and foremost, reminds us that it is God who's working in us. God, through the working of His Spirit who's dwelling in us, is working out our salvation, or is enabling and helping us to work out our salvation. And He's working all things in us to His good pleasure. It is God who is working in us, so we must rely on Him. We must trust in Him in all things. And so how are we to do this? How are we to be working out our salvation with fear and trembling before a God who is working in us? Well, Paul tells us in verse 14, do all things without grumbling or questioning. Paul could have said just about any other thing there, and I probably would have been happier with it, at least I think. But in this time, where he's called us to work out our salvation without grumbling and without questioning, I'm finding that a challenge. I don't know if you are, but I am. It seems like every day I'm grumbling and questioning why we're in the situation we're in, and not that I'm grumbling or questioning the decision to quarantine. I think it's good and right, and I think we need to obey the civil authorities as they're trying to protect and keep us so that we don't have far more fatalities than we might. But that doesn't mean I don't grumble. God, why? Why are we living in times such as these? Why are we going through this? Why am I having to hear news about people who are suffering physically? Why am I having to talk to people I love about how they're losing jobs and uncertain how they're going to pay bills? And I confess before you that I grumble and I question. And that's exactly what we're not supposed to do. We're not supposed to come and grumbling with questions, understanding who it is that we come before. Instead of grumbling, instead of questioning, we are to be, as he says in verse 15, blameless and innocent children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. Paul is building a contrast here for us, that we are not to be grumblers and questioners. We're not to act like the world, this twisted generation. No, we're to be holy and blameless children of God. This is what we're called to be, holy and blameless. And so this is what it looks like to live as a light in the world, to be different than those around us. To not grumble, to not question, even as the world may question around us. We have to be reminded that God is in control. He is indeed working all things to his good pleasure. Or even as he told us earlier in Philippians, that he's working all things to our good. Do we believe that God is working this to our good? Not understanding at this point what that good may be. Paul continues in 15. That as we live blameless and innocent, as we live different than this crooked and twisted generation, we are to be among those who shine as light in the world. Brothers and sisters in Christ, this is our calling, to shine as light in the darkness. All that is not of God is of the darkness, and we are to pierce the darkness with the light, understanding that darkness cannot but flee before the light. Are we living our faith in such a way that it is chasing away the darkness, that people are looking at us and saying, what is different about those people? What is different about the hope that they have? How is it that they can endure with such hope and joy and gladness in this time of worry and distress? Now, I know you might even be saying to yourself, well, how do we do this? We're so isolated. And I think there's an immediate response there, that we would be remiss if we didn't understand that our family needs this. Are we grumbling and questioning before our family? Or as we talk to others on the phone, are we complaining? Or are we using it as an opportunity to proclaim the gospel of Jesus, to be a light for the gospel in this world? Are we shining as lights? Are we holding fast, as he says in verse 16, to the word of life? That is the gospel. Are we holding fast to the words that give us life, so that in the day of Christ we may be proud that we did not run or labor in vain? We are to live the Christian life in such a way that it is not in vain, that we run and we labor to the end. And understand me, it's not the worry that we labor and we work in the hopes that maybe we'll get into heaven. No, we have a hope and a security in heaven already, because if we've placed our trust in Christ, then we know what Christ has done for us. This is what we talked about last week, or yesterday in our lesson. That Christ came and humbled himself and took on flesh and went to the cross and died so that we might have life. But now that we are in him and he is in us, we are to labor in such a way, we are to run in such a way that it is not in vain. If we are to look at ourselves and to consider our lives as Christians, are we doing it in such a way that we're not doing it in vain? Paul concludes here in 17 and 18. He says, even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Paul, in talking about the drink offering here, is talking about an Old Testament offering, but in essence, all he's saying is this: we are to pour ourselves out. He has poured himself out for the work of the gospel, for the people of Philippi, for also all the other churches that he planted. He is pouring himself out for the sake of the gospel. And this is something that's hard when you think about a cup and it pours out, and it's not just halfway, but all the way. Are we completely pouring ourselves out for the sake of the gospel? And look, that's a hard question, because if I am going to be honest before you right now, I would say, no, I'm not pouring myself out all the way. There are times I get discouraged and I get worried and I get stingy, and I stop pouring. Maybe I'm struggling with insecurities, which I often do. If you're anything like me, I'm often insecure. Am I doing enough? And are the things that I'm doing the right things? I struggle with self-doubt. All of these things are being magnified in this time. And it's hard. But we're to continue to pour ourselves out, understanding that as we act as lights in the world, we know that there's only one place, there's only one word that can bring life. And all these come from God. We must hold firm to that. Without grumbling, without questioning, we're to hold the words of life. And as we pour ourselves out, we're to count it a joy. We're to count it a joy. And Paul concludes in verse 18, not only that he's rejoicing with them, but his hope is that you should be glad and rejoice also with Paul. We are to rejoice with one another in our sufferings. Paul rejoices with them, and he wants them to rejoice with him. And so are we rejoicing with one another as we suffer, as we endure, as we labor, as we pour ourselves out as a drink offering? And that's an odd thing to say, brothers and sisters out there in internet land, I want you to rejoice with me even in my insecurities. And pray for me that even in my insecurities that I continue to pour myself out for not my own sake, and not so that you can simply say, oh, you're doing such a good job, but for the sake of Christ and his gospel. And likewise, me to you, I can pray with you and for you that you are pouring yourselves out, that you are not, in this time of isolation, over-isolating yourself, that you're not reaching out to others, that you're not growing weary and despondent and isolated, but rejoice with you and encourage you and strengthen you to pour yourself out as a drink offering. Are we doing this? Are we rejoicing in all situations, no matter what the circumstances? And that's hard. Can we say that we are rejoicing in the midst of this COVID outbreak, in this midst of these trying times, in the midst of all this? Are we looking for the way in which we can serve Christ and his kingdom in obedience and be a light to the world around us? That's my prayer and my hope for myself. It's my prayer and my hope for you, that you would be the light of Christ, that you would know the light of Christ, and that you would pour yourself out in obedience and love to him, shining as a light in this world that needs the light of Christ. We'll be back tomorrow with another video as we continue in Philippians chapter 2. I would encourage you again, if you can log into YouTube, to like the video, to subscribe to the page. It should be on the browser there somewhere. I think sometimes also, and I don't know if it's in this corner over here or in this corner over here, there's a little circle with the church logo in it that you can click on, that and it helps you subscribe. And that way you can continue to get updates on these videos. I'm hoping to put a little bit more editing to these videos. I'm trying to learn editing software, so you might see some of that today if I can get it to work. Not maybe in the coming days. But just know that you are loved and you are missed and you were prayed for, and we hope, I know me and my whole family, we hope to see you again real soon.